It is Friday, and we are working for Crusoe, Friday, April 11th, 2025, in the City of Angels, East Sam Park, in the biggest little city in the world. I am John Ramey. We're going to talk about both Sudans. We're going to talk about Israel. Both of those topics, or all three of those topics, are going to be heavy, serious, generally discouraging. But first, let's start with a light-hearted buffoonery of the Trump administration's trade wars. Nothing but trade wars. Shall we start there, Sam?
Sure.
Okay, and also, we're going to get into this. I would like your elevator pitch or elevator length explanation about the importance of the yield on U.S. government bonds at the end of this.
Okay, I'll do my best on that.
Yeah, it's okay. Here we go. New York Times. Yields on U.S. government bonds spiked sharply on Friday, that's today, and a sign that the world's faith in the United States economy has been shaken by President Trump's trade war with China. The rise in the yield on 10-year Treasury bonds came as the United States and China, the world's two biggest economies, kept up a fast-moving tit-for-tat tariff fight that has fueled worries over a global recession. China responded to President Trump's tariffs on Friday, today, mocking the American president's policies as, quote, a joke, and raising its own tariffs on U.S. goods to 125%. In recent days, Mr. Trump has imposed a minimum tariff rate of 145% on all Chinese exports to the United States. Okay, now the New York Times gives a little explainer about government bonds. Would you like to hear that?
Sure.
Or do you want to take? Okay. So the Times says U.S. government bonds, known as treasuries, form a major part of the foundation of the global financial system. I'm with them so far. The yield on a 10-year treasury, which underpins corporate and consumer borrowing, rose 0.1 of a percentage point Friday, today, bringing it up from less than 4% at the end of last week to more than 4.5% this week. So the yield is going up. This is the Times again. Yields, or the return an investor expects expressed as a percentage of the bond's face value, generally rise when many investors are seeking to sell, driving bond prices down. That means that as yields have been rising this week, investors around the world holding trillions of dollars in treasuries are seeing their value suddenly decline.
That's correct. Yeah.
Why does the yield go up mean it's worth less?
Because that is the face value of the asset declines. Then, in other words, if you wanted to try and sell those bonds in the resale
which
bond
is dead,
market,
which is dead,
right?
Yeah.
You would get less for them.
Okay.
Right. And so, but basically, it's just an interest rate. Right. I mean,
that's why you buy debt.
Yeah. Right. You're getting the interest rate that the government has to pay. Right. These are government bonds, and the government has to pay interest on the debt. So the higher the interest, the higher the total debt. Right. Basically, what Donald Trump has done is raise the national debt. For instance, people talk about the stock market a lot, right? And we talk about it sometimes, right? And we always make sure to mention the stock market is not the economy, right?
Now, I deliberately omitted the New York Times reporting on the stock market today because
okay, that's fine, right?
It'll come and go. Yeah,
and that's true. The stock market is not the economy, and the bond market is not the economy either. But it's more of the economy than the stock market, right? Because it touches everything. Stocks are just shares in companies, right? The interest rates basically affect everybody. They affect companies who issue their own debt. They affect, because treasuries are the benchmark of the entire credit market, not just in the United States, but all around the world. U.S. treasuries are esteemed to be the safest assets.
Yes.
And now it seems as though they're not that safe. If the interest rates on them are rising, then they're deemed to be less secure assets than they were in the past.
It's no different than a credit card rate is different to a rate on an auto loan because
that's right, and
it's not secured, whereas you can repossess a car.
Both of those rates, credit cards and auto loans, along with mortgages and corporate debt, any kind of debt you can imagine, is indexed on the basis of the treasury yield. So this is going to drive up borrowing costs for everybody. And many people are speculating that it was this spike in bond yields that we've been just talking about is what caused Donald Trump to rescind the enormous Liberation Day, quote unquote, reciprocal tariffs that he instituted merely a week earlier. And so now I want to pause right here because this whole episode of the trade war is just the decision of one individual person, the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And so it would be very easy to turn this whole segment into just dunking on Trump. And I'm sure we'll get to a little bit of that. But I think we do better to focus on issues which you very astutely have brought up in terms of exactly what this means, right? This is raising borrowing costs for everybody on top of raising just the retail prices of just about anything you're ever going to buy this year. And so
Right. Life got more expensive.
that's right, and it's for this reason that, and on top of a number of other reasons, for instance, today's decline, catastrophic consumer sentiment report from the University of Michigan.
That's right.
Where many investment professionals are starting to raise the likelihood of a recession this year. There are varying estimates of that likelihood. Some of it put it at more than 50%, some of it less. But all of those estimates have gone up in the past week, although some of them have declined since Trump decided to withdraw a lot of the retaliatory tariffs.
One other note regarding, again, retaliatory tariffs. That's fake too. The Roosevelt administration passed a law about retaliatory tariffs in like 1934. Paul Krugman explained on the Ezra Klein show this week. So he's not bringing in anything new. It's already a law, right? As you said, they're so-called retaliatory tariffs.
Yeah, I mean, there are so many ridiculous aspects of this story that it would be, I think, fruitless to enumerate each one of them. But while we're, talking about all these different ways that this is a terrible outcome, and it is, there was one element of this that I think might count as a success for the Trump administration, if inadvertent, perhaps. But what they have succeeded in doing is isolating China, now the trade war is really almost entirely, not entirely, but predominantly between the United States and China, as you mentioned at the top of this segment, right? It's tariffs of more than 100% between those two countries, right?
Whereas they're calling each other's names, right? They said it's a joke. China called it a joke.
Or China's calling us names. I thought it was very interesting. The night before Trump withdrew the retaliatory tariffs, he was speaking at a fancy Republican congressional event, and he said that all these other countries are lining up to kiss my ass, was the memorable phrase he used in that context. Now, I'm
an apex of presidential rhetoric.
That's right. Out. I'm confident that many countries have been getting in touch with the Trump administration, but he has not named any of those countries. The only ones we know that have made any explicit overtures, and I say overtures meaning the beginning of a negotiation, are Vietnam, Japan, South Korea, and most notably, I would say, Israel, in which Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu flew to Washington on Monday and sat in the Oval Office next to Trump in front of the TV cameras and pledged to eliminate Israel's trade surplus versus the United States. And I think this is ridiculous, but at the moment that he was saying it, I was thinking to myself, I was imagining every other world leader saying, "Oh, thanks a lot, Bibi," because
Right now, we have to do this.
well, yeah, Netanyahu said that he hoped this would serve as a model for other countries in terms of their trade relations with the United States. But as the week wore on, I started to think, you know what? Especially after Trump withdrew the tariffs because he was spooked by the bond market. I started to think that maybe this is what all the other world leaders should do. They should just maybe all fly to Mar-a-Lago at once and sign an enormous piece of cardboard saying,
Right.
"Don't worry, Donald,
We'll do our best.
we're all going to eliminate our trade
Yeah.
deficits with you, and please get rid of the tariffs." And then they should all just fly home and not do
Of
anything.
course. Right. Because then Trump can declare it a win in his own mind and in his own media silo.
Yeah, or something. But then, if they don't do anything and Trump says, "Hey, you didn't do anything," then they can come back and say, "Oh, sorry, what are you going to do? Crash your own bond market again?"
Right.
Right?
Well,
and
because
so,
it's preposterous. Like, how is Israel going to eliminate its trade surplus with the United States? It's a country of 6 million people. I don't care what the particular sector is.
yeah, exactly. And I don't think they actually are going to do this. And that's exactly the point I'm making, right?
Yeah.
Is
Okay. Yeah.
that just say
I mean,
you're
that
going.
just doesn't make sense. It's
Well, but the thing is,
impossible.
but you'd be taking a page from Trump's own book. Just say you're
Just
going to do
lying.
something, right? And don't do it. Say you have done it, or maybe just say, "Well, what are you going to do?" Right? I mean, and so in this sense, Trump has actually eliminated almost all the leverage he has with every other country except China. However, in that case, he actually does have quite a lot of leverage over China because it is the largest bilateral trading relationship in the world. And China exports tons and tons and tons of stuff to our country. Now, they have cards to play as well, which they are playing right now. For instance, they're going to enormously damage agricultural exports from the United States, right? They buy tons of soybeans and other kinds of food and agricultural products from the United States. They're not going to be buying any. I mean, these tariff rates, 125%, 145%. I mean, it really amounts to a trade embargo. The idea that any of this trade is actually going to occur, I'm sure a little bit will, just out of necessity, right? But who's going to buy these things that are suddenly more than twice as expensive? Meanwhile, you might recall, John, that in one of our episodes last year, we talked about Xi Jinping making a state visit to Peru to inaugurate the
Yeah.
opening of a new megaport on the west coast of Peru. This is how they're going to import foodstuffs from Brazil mainly, which shares a border with Peru. So they're just going with Peru. So they're just going to ship their foodstuffs west across the South American continent to Peru and out through this brand new megaport in Shanghai. Gosh, it really
So,
was fortuitous that they opened that port, wasn't it? It's
right.
almost like they planned it.
It's like they're just going to say, fine, we will stop buying from the United States and start buying from Brazil. Nobody in China is going to starve because of this tariff.
Well, I mean, it's going to be bad for people in China too, right?
Sure.
I mean, that food will cost more, right? Because if you
Sure.
raise tariffs, the global prices rise. It doesn't matter,
Right.
it's
But if they're supplying from Brazil with a more favorable trade arrangement, then, I guess Brazil's got a lot of farmland.
Yes, and let's face it, Brazil, along with China, are core members of the BRICS grouping. They have well-established relationships. It's possible that they can come to a better price arrangement, but it will still be more expensive. This is still going to hurt people in China. We should make no bones about that.
Okay.
But the point I'm making is that Trump seems to think, for instance, he talked about people kissing his ass a day later after withdrawing the tariffs. He was in the Oval Office. He talked twice. He mentioned twice that what a smart guy Xi Jinping is, right? He's the one actually explicitly and visibly kissing another foreign leader's ass.
I know.
He is kissing Xi Jinping's ass in public. And very few people want to come out and say this just because making fun of Trump probably isn't going to help anything. But that's basically what's going on. And people all through his administration say that he wants to negotiate this one-on-one with Xi Jinping. And that's just not generally how the Chinese negotiate ever, right? They, build these things up through lower level personnel and come to some arrangement, and eventually there might be a phone call or a face-to-face meeting, but that's not going to happen soon. Xi is going to be making state visits to, what do you know, Malaysia, Cambodia,
Right.
Vietnam, all through next week, right? These are important middleman countries, or at least they have been, where China ships their goods out through those countries in order to try and escape the tariffs that they've been subject to even before all this happened. I think that's going to be more difficult. That'll be tricky to try and figure out if they can still do that. They're going to give it a shot, though. And meanwhile, they're going to try and see what other kinds of arrangements they can come to just between themselves and all those three countries as well.
I tell you what, there may be a recession. I'm not saying there will be. There may be a recession, but I think an explosive job market would be like country of origin agent, right? Now, because of all these tariffs, they're going to be hiring people to figure out where this thing came from. Did it sit in a warehouse in Northern Ireland for 8 hours before being shipped to the United States, right? Was this a British good or from the EU? Or did
Yes,
this sit, I mean, like, talk about bureaucrats, right?
and yeah, and that's just one of thousands of reasons why you don't do stuff like this.
Yeah,
It just
it's
makes it
so
more
inefficient.
complicated for
Yeah.
everything. Yes, exactly. And so, this is going
Going
to
to be a growth job market, I'm telling you.
well, but by how much, right? And how many accountants are there, right? I mean, and they're just going to charge more money, right? Because there's suddenly going to be a lot more demand for their labor. I mean, we could go on and on about this, and we will. Believe me, this is not the last time we're going to talk about this year, because this is one of the most serious policy blunders that I think we've ever seen. Now, I wasn't alive when Lyndon Johnson started to ramp up the troop deployments to Vietnam.
Right.
All right.
Right.
But this is going to be way up there. And to return to where we started with the bond market, right? Though, again, those yields ticked down a little bit after Trump rescinded the tariffs, but the real danger would be if he'd left the tariffs on. The next Treasury auction could easily have just been a bloodbath. And that's why I think that we're not going to see a lot more development in the trade war with countries outside of China, right? I think that most of that will sort of ease down over the rest of the year. But this trade war with China by itself is just enormous.
The Onion's recap of the 20th century was called Our Dumb Century. I wonder how
Yes.
they're going to top it, because a quarter of the way into the 21st, this is an aggressively dumb century.
Well, I have to say, I mean, I've always been a big fan of The Onion, but they're killing it right now just because they've
I
got so
know.
much material. I mean,
Best material imaginable.
You don't even have to read the story if there even is one. Their headlines are just perfect, right? Because it's all so stupid.
It's aggressively dumb out there.
Yeah, and it's really difficult to comprehend.
Okay, so that concludes the lighter portion of the program. Now let's dig into demoralizing international news. Where would you like to begin? Israel or Sudan and South Sudan?
Let's start with Israel.
Okay. The BBC reporting yesterday, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has rejected criticism of the Gaza war by some Air Force reservists, calling it, quote, unforgivable. The Israeli military said it would dismiss serving reservists who had signed a letter calling for the return of Israeli hostages to be prioritized over fighting Hamas. The letter also says the current fighting is politically motivated and will lead to the deaths of hostages, Israeli soldiers, and innocent civilians. These are Israeli reservists who signed a letter, a public open letter. The Israeli military said it could not allow serving reservists to engage in political protests. Israel resumed its air and ground campaign in Gaza last month, saying that military pressure would force Hamas to release the hostages it is still holding. Okay. Also this week, AP reporting Israel has dramatically expanded its footprint in the Gaza Strip since relaunching its war against Hamas last month. Israel now controls more than 50% of the territory and is squeezing Palestinians into shrinking wedges of land.
No, okay, now I just want to break in just for a moment.
Yeah,
And
no, that's the ball is yours. The
okay,
floor is
fine.
yours.
As we discussed the first time we had an episode after October 7th of 2023, the Gaza Strip at that time was already one of the most densely populated areas on the planet, if
Got
not
like
the
2
most.
million people there at that time.
Yes, right. Very few of them have left, right? So it's now twice as densely populated, or it could be, that is. I don't think that Israel has quite succeeded in driving all the Palestinians out of the areas of the Strip that their military is currently occupying. But that's what they're trying to do. And so I just want to point that out, that there's enormous numbers of people being squeezed into a wasteland of Gaza. And Israel Katz, the defense
Defense minister.
of Israel, mentioned that they're doing this in accordance with Donald Trump's plan to essentially depopulate the Strip. I don't know where they think people are going to go.
Well, that's what have they said anything publicly? Like, we expect these people to go to Egypt? Egypt's
I don't
like,
think
no.
so.
Jordan's already said we're full.
And meanwhile, even before October 7th of 2023, the Israeli incursions into the West Bank were already proceeding at a record level. And since then, they haven't declined at all. If anything, that land dispute has only escalated. So this policy of displacement of Palestinians is at levels that we've never seen before. And you could argue, I think, up until this year that, the United States was trying to mitigate the damages from the pursuit of these policies. You can't make that argument now. And it would be, frankly, it was difficult to make it even before Donald Trump came back into office, but it's impossible to make it now. The entire policy of both the United States and Israel really is ethnic cleansing explicitly. And we're going to be on the hook for this. Now, as we've just been discussing, we've got our own problems to deal with right now. But this is going to come back to bite us on some level. We just don't know exactly how.
As somebody who has been, I'm going to say somewhat, perhaps naively shocked at how easily the rest of the world wants to criticize Israel's defense of itself, but also not endorsing the steps they've taken in this particular post-October 7th era. I think it's important to see that military reservists in Israel are saying this is wrong, because if you're going to make if you're going to level the accusation that criticizing this particular Israeli military campaign is somehow anti-Semitic, I don't think Israeli reservists are anti-Semites.
I don't think so either. And I think that's an important point to raise. I think we should also mention that I think it was 2 weeks ago, there were protests in the Strip of a couple hundred people against Hamas. And we should point out also that it's really because of October 7th that all of this escalation has occurred. And Hamas has to be held culpable for that also, right? If they're the ones who brought ruin on the Palestinian people in a way that had never been brought before. And it's important that we should point that out also. Still, this is indefensible, right? What Israel is doing in both Gaza and the West Bank right now is not defensible on any level. And it and the worst part about it to me is that it's difficult to see any end of this, right? How this turns out. I despair of any possibility of there being a good ending to this process.
Shall we turn to Sudan and South Sudan?
Sure.
Okay. Reuters reporting from The Hague. Sudan told the International Court of Justice Thursday, that's yesterday, that the United Arab Emirates was violating the Genocide Convention by supporting paramilitary forces in Darfur. But the UAE argued the case should be thrown out as the court lacked jurisdiction. All right, so just real quick. If somebody accuses me of violating the Genocide Convention and I'm not, I don't say this isn't your jurisdiction. You know what I mean?
Yes, it would seem to be a
Yeah.
rather weak defense.
Yikes, United Arab Emirates.
Okay,
Okay,
well, to
go
be
ahead.
fair, right, the UAE has always denied that they support the Rapid Support Forces, which are one of the main groupings involved in the civil war in Sudan, which we've talked about a few times. We talked about it right when it broke out about 2 years ago. And so that's not what I'm saying is that's not the UAE's only defense, just that
Okay.
that's a
Just saying it's the
technicality.
first sentence in the Reuters report.
I get that, but
Yeah.
I'm sure if you read that down, they will
Yes.
mention that also.
Okay.
But part of the reason this is happening is that the Sudanese Armed Forces, or the SAF, which is the opponents of the RSF in the civil war, have recently made dramatic gains, mainly in taking back the capital, Khartoum. And when the civil war broke out, the RSF rather quickly pushed the Sudanese armed forces up into the northeast corner of the country in Port Sudan along the Red Sea. And this was, it looked like the RSF could take over, but the armed forces have gotten they have their own international backers, which are numerous, and they've been able to push the RSF back to the point where they can take back the capital. Now, that I mean, it's hard to see any of this as good. This is just, I mean, the Sudan, since the civil war broke out, again, about 2 years ago, has been the world's worst humanitarian catastrophe. It's 40 million people across an enormous amount of land. And the best part about these
20 times the population of Gaza at the
That's
start
right.
of the Israeli military campaign.
Exactly, and it's gotten very little coverage in comparison. And I would say it was a tiny fraction of the coverage. But if the SAF now has a remit that extends from Port Sudan all the way south and southwest to the capital, this will help international aid get through to larger portions of the country than it's been able to do so far. And that's an improvement. Unfortunately, much less of that aid will be coming from the United States than it used to because, well, we just don't want to do that anymore. But at least some aid can be brought through to other areas of the country. And I think the caveat here is that, as we've mentioned, Sudan is very large, and for the military, the Sudanese armed forces, to be able to project power even further to the west is just a difficult logistical problem. And so this will almost certainly go on for quite some time. The RSF has retreated to the west of the country. Their stronghold has always been the Darfur region. They are the descendants of the Janjaweed militia who took part in the earlier Sudanese genocide about 20 years ago, and they're doing quite a lot of the same things again. And by the way, so are the Sudanese armed forces. They have been shelling civilian areas in Darfur and wreaking just enormous destruction on the population there. So this is a small improvement in the disposition of the Sudanese civil war, but it's not a large one.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up like RSF, the rebels come from the west, Darfur. That's where they just have been it's been gestating for decades, right?
Many
I mean,
years,
that's
yes.
yeah. Okay,
And they, and just to review, and then we talked about this when the war broke out, but the RSF and the SAF had a power sharing agreement,
right.
which after the overthrow of the former dictator Omar al-Bashir, and so that agreement fell apart, and that's what caused the civil war to break out 2 years ago.
Oh, speaking of agreements falling apart and potential civil war
And
fallout,
Sudan's, yeah.
yeah, we take it as South Sudan. BBC reporting rising tensions in the East African country of Sudan, culminating in the 26th of March arrest of Vice President Riek Machar, have sparked concerns that the world's youngest nation is headed for another civil war. Machar's party, the Sudan People's Liberation Movement in Opposition, that is the SPLM-IO, has said his house arrest, quote, effectively brings to a collapse, end of quote, the fragile 2018 peace agreement that ended 5 years of fighting. So South Sudan had its own civil war. It gained independence in 2011 from Sudan. 2 years into independence, a civil war erupted when the leader of the Sudan People's Liberation Movement, President Salva Kiir, dismissed Machar as vice president. He accused Machar of plotting a coup. Okay. So you had like a power sharing agreement, right?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. So
Machar and Kiir were allies in the liberation struggle that caused South Sudan to break away from Sudan.
Right. It's like your Chiang Kai-shek Mao thing, right? They're allies in fighting the Japanese, and then they resume their civil war. Okay, the ensuing conflict, the civil war in South Sudan, largely fought along ethnic lines between supporters of the two leaders, estimated 400,000 deaths and 2.5 million people being forced from their homes. That's more than a fifth of the population. So, the peace deal was Machar was reinstated as vice president. Okay, but the current crisis, this is back to the reporting from BBC. The current crisis was sparked at the beginning of March when the White Army Militia, which was allied to Machar during the Civil War, clashed with the army in Upper Nile State and overran a military base in Nasir, and then a UN helicopter attempting to evacuate troops came under fire. People died, including a high-ranking army general. 3 weeks later, Machar and several of his associates were arrested. They were accused of trying to stir up a rebellion. So it's essentially the same reason Machar got fired 2 years into the power sharing agreement. He was accused of plotting a coup. Then there's a giant civil war and 500,000 people die. It's kind of the cycle starting again.
Sort of, yes. And during the civil war in regular Sudan, I guess, because South Sudan was
Sudan classic.
Yeah, right. Because South Sudan was relatively peaceable at that time, many refugees flowed into South Sudan from Sudan just to escape the fighting. And so what's going to happen to them now? If South Sudan breaks out into civil war, these people are just going to be caught in no man's land with nowhere to go. And it's going to be just devastating. And to be fair, there's nothing that the United States or any other country can really do about this. Sudan is an enormous amount of territory. Many, many people live there and in South Sudan. I mean, basically, this was obvious from the beginning of the war in Sudan, the civil war in Sudan 2 years ago, right? Where basically everybody just said, they didn't say, but the response was essentially, let's just hope that one side wins quickly, right? And we'll deal with them, right? Because there's nothing we can actually do. And that hasn't worked out. And it doesn't seem like it's going to work out. If anything, things are mostly getting worse, apart from the SAF regaining the capital. That's the only good news that we've seen in this whole spectacle. And this is just a bad time for the United States to be withdrawing from its global leadership role. Again, there's very little that we could possibly do. But the idea
we
that
could provide humanitarian aid, or at least some kind of rhetorical leadership,
or something, right? And I think Marco Rubio, to his credit, has issued statements of concern about the possible outbreak of civil war in South Sudan. But that's what anybody, and what any top diplomat in diplomat in any country would do.
Right. That's sea-level international diplomacy.
Yeah, it's just perfunctory. It's just, as little as you can expect anybody to do.
Okay, so the theme of this episode, in conclusion, is innocent people impacted in varying degrees of severity by human folly. And
Yes.
we and the Chinese and everybody will suffer the effects of a trade war, which is bad. I suppose people could starve if it's mishandled, or maybe they will starve.
Businesses are failing now
yeah.
in this country.
Right. And then if you think that's bad, well, you could have nowhere to go, which is happening not only in Gaza, but in both Sudans.
Yes. And I mean, again, in Israel and Gaza and in the Sudans, these are issues that have been playing out for decades. So it's not exactly a surprise that any of these things are happening. And that's why we started with the trade war, because this is just a dumb thing to do for no reason. And that's why it's so maddening.
Right. The conflict in Gaza, the conflict in Sudan and South Sudan have reasons.
Yes, and they're
Right.
they're very complicated.
Yeah.
They're very intractable. The trade war,
Yeah.
no, right?
No.
It's actually very simple, right? The impact of it is going to be large and far-reaching, but the reasons for it, very simple to understand.
Yeah, Donald Trump is not an economist and
That's right.
could not pass Econ 101. Okay, that'll do it for us. Next week, I'm sure something interesting will happen, Sam, but is there anything
sure
on our
that's true.
fixed calendar you're keeping an
Nothing
eye
I
on?
can actually think of. I mean, we
Yeah,
we might talk about Xi's visits to his neighbors in Southeast Asia. I think that will be something to keep an eye on. So that's the only thing I can think of right now.
Okay. Well, enjoy your spring weekend, everybody.
Thanks, folks.
Yeah. He's Sam. I'm John. Peace.